Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last meeting. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, hello.
Nice. How is Leipzig?
Cold as usual, but otherwise fine. How are you? Are you doing all right?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes, we're trying to get back to usual. Um, Anyone else coming? I don't know. Um, Wait, no, that's not how we do it. We do it like this. So there's not a lot left to talk about. The issue that I would like to address a little bit today is the classification and how we do it, and just a little bit of questions around that. And after that, I was thinking about just like going through highlights or some important points of the course and just see if there's any questions or anything that is not clear enough or any follow-up or anything. Um, is there any question before we begin? Okay, so in general, when we talk about classification, at least the original concept was uh, taken pretty much as it is from biology or phylogenetics. So the assumption is that one organism gives birth to another organism and inherits or like gives in inheritance its DNA or something like that. It is obviously a little bit different in languages than it is in living organisms because you don't need two different languages to create a new language, and one language can change into multiple different languages. But there is some kind of, at least to some extent, there is the notion of DNA that a language inherits from its ancestors. And in the past century or so, there have been attempts to challenge this approach and try to think what is more the way that languages change and develop um, other than living organisms. Um, so today, like the two most famous approaches that people still use to classify languages is the one based on a family tree, which is essentially the biological one, the phylogenetic one, and the other one is what is called the wave theory, which is the assumption that instead of a language giving an inheritance to another language its DNA, we look at a map that just has phenomena spreading on it, kind of like waves in a pond or something like that, or in a puddle. So aerial or geographical spreading as opposed to temporal inheritance, so to speak. Any question about that before we talk a little bit about what this means in the Semitic languages? No? So if we look at phylogenetics specifically, which is the still, even though people know that there's some things about it that is old-fashioned and not necessarily most suitable for languages, people still use it to classify languages more than any other approach. And it is based essentially on the two ideas of retentions and innovations. So when a language has a feature, we assume that it is either something that it inherited or retained from its ancestor or innovated which means that it is not inherited from its ancestor. And we use these ideas to classify languages. What do you think is the difference between a retention and an innovation for classification purposes or in general? Hello, Yoshua. So what I was going at is that retentions are somewhat what we call trivial, or they would be the default option. Especially this seems to be correct in Semitic, so I don't really know about other language families and how innovative they might be, but in Semitic, it seems quite clear that a retention is the default option. So most of the features that a language has are retentions. And the opposite of a retention would be a loss of a certain feature. Yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, but for something to be considered a retention, you have to have like a comparison, right? Because you can't
Yes.
say retain this. Like you could say, for example, that I don't know, but like modern German retained the first sound from like I don't know Middle High German, but it didn't retain it from like Proto-Indo-European. So
Yes, you're
it's like
absolutely right.
so what's like when do you call something a retention as opposed like you always need a reference point, right?
Yes, yes, that is absolutely right. So yeah, for example, um, if we look at any Central Semitic language like Arabic, for example, so it's yaf'ulu, it's a future paradigm or present future is a retention from Proto-Central Semitic or something like that, but it is not a retention from something earlier than that. So yes, an innovation at one point still usually does become a retention later for the descendant languages. That is absolutely correct. So yes, a language that, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. So all of these features that a language has, which we usually look at as retentions, are actually retentions from different periods of time, and they were all innovations at some point because nothing is a retention from the beginning of time, I guess, or at least that's how we assume, but we have no idea.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you consider a borrowed feature from other language also kind of innovation or
Yes.
something else?
Yes, this is a kind of
Okay.
innovation. So this system, looking at it from a phylogenetic aspect or from a phylogenetic angle, there is no such thing as borrowing a feature because we just look at it as an innovation. So like say I don't know, if we take this to the biological example, if someone is traumatized at some point and this influences their character, well, it's still an innovation regardless of where he got that, like at least as long as it's not a retention. So like it's a horizontal spreading of a feature, which this approach does not account for. So for this, it is just an innovation. So for this approach, for example, Arabic and Ethio-Semitic and modern South Arabian and Old South Arabian all had this innovation of p to f. We don't know what caused it or how it spread or where it happened exactly. But the thing is, for this system, since they are all in different places on the tree, they all had to have this innovation at their own point. But if we look at it from a horizontal or a geographical approach or angle, then we see that this is a shared innovation that is a borrowing or influence or contact, or there are a lot of options. Any other question? Okay, so as I have already implied, the biggest problem with this approach is that there are areal features. These do exist. The most, say, prominent phenomenon known in linguistics to demonstrate this is what we call in German Sprachbund, so an area that has a list of areal features um, that are characteristic to the languages in it, regardless of their genetic affiliation. So Ethiopia is a very good example for that. There is a list of features that apply to Ethiopian languages, whether they are Semitic or Cushitic or Omotic or Nilotic. That means Afroasiatic or even not Afroasiatic, but they still, it's a convergence area. Maybe that's the English term. So languages that were in significant contact for a very long time converged, somewhat converged to be more like each other. I think, and also in the Caucasus, there's in the area of Georgia, there's Sprachbund, but I don't know. And the other problem would be coincidence. So, for example, if we have two language groups that share a certain innovation, how do we know that it is indeed a shared innovation and not just a coincidence? Or on the other hand, if we have two language groups that lost a certain feature, did not retain it, how do we know if they did not retain it together or if it is a coincidence? What do you guys think?
I mean, I think if you have to, like, if the two languages do not have not had any contact, for example, at the time of the shared innovation, that would be like that would point towards a coincidence. But I do think, and I'm not sure about this, but for example, if you look at this, like the situation of noon in the Semitic languages, because it's very weak consonant, and I don't know, maybe that's not like a thing of the Semitic languages, but rather like a general thing of like the consonant that is so weak. But in so many languages, and I don't know if this happened like independently from each other or not. But like Akkadian, for example, and then Ugaritic on the other hand, have like this very weak noon.
Yes.
And so I feel like there might also be predictors within like the language or within the proto language or how it works that might make some features more prone to get lost, to get changed in a certain direction. So it could be like a coincidence, but also like one that is kind of predictable. I don't know.
Yeah, that is very clever and correct. In general, these languages still like they do have a very large shared inherited bank of features, which is like it makes a lot of sense for it to be prone to certain changes, like not 100%, but to some extent it is very likely that certain changes would happen. Like, for example, if we see that the case system was lost in all of the Semitic languages, we know that it happened in different times and in different ways, so it is not likely to be an areal feature or retention from some point, just something that happened because Semitic languages don't really need cases or because cases are not very, I don't know, but just like, yeah, you're absolutely right. That makes a lot of sense. Specifically regarding Nun, I mentioned this that nasal codas are specifically vulnerable cross-linguistically, specifically in the realm of place of articulation. But in Semitic, this is considered a North Semitic areal feature. So it is something that is mostly common with Akkadian, Ugaritic, Canaanite, and some dialects of Aramaic. I'm not sure about all of them, and extremely rarely in Arabic, but in the other, maybe Sabaic, all the other languages, it doesn't really happen. But yeah, you're right. So yeah, one of the good criteria for this is that the languages must be in contact, but sometimes it is very hard to tell. So if the languages are not very well attested, for example, or if what we have attested is only like, I don't know, funerary or just like texts that are not very indicative of like trade or something like that, we don't have like we don't have enough information about that. So for example, if we want to say if we look at a certain feature that is common between two language groups, so for example, having the consonant R instead of N in the word for two and in the word for sun, which is common to Aramaic and modern South Arabian. So Bab in Aramaic and Tre or something like that, two. So it is very hard to say if such a thing would be a coincidence, because you have to, if it's a coincidence, you have to justify it. You have to say this is a cross-linguistically well-attested shift, or this is something that is prone to happen for some reason. Or if it's an aerial feature, you have to explain how come it's an aerial feature if they're so far away from each other and so far. So yeah, it is very hard to determine sometimes. But the criteria you mentioned are very, very good. Any other thought about this? Anyone?
I have a question. Do you believe that there are some certain, I don't know, general tendencies of for change for change that I don't know happen possibly everywhere?
Well, yes, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, because I guess what linguists usually think is that there are certain paths of changes. So like
Mhm.
if a language is very different from another language, they would not change in the same way probably, but they would change differently, each in accordance with the features of its own. And there is more than one path that even a certain language can take. So like two languages that are identical, or one language can split into two different languages that act completely differently. So it's not something anyone can predict. But if we look at it retroactively, there are certain features that we see happening. So there are certain changes that are much more prone to happen than others. If we look at the Semitic languages once again, so we see that the sibilants, or specifically the lateral fricatives and the interdentals, are very problematic or very marked. So they are prone to merge into other consonants. We can see that the gutturals are very marked, and or the specifically the glottals, and more than that, even the uvular fricatives, very marked and prone to merge into other consonants. So there are these tendencies, but sometimes a language can also act completely the opposite from what we would expect, and it's very hard to justify, just analyze. That's what we do.
So maybe I can say that so within a certain language family, it's probably more easy to find those common features or common tendencies,
I
or
think
those
so.
things are more, I don't know, observable.
I think so. And the smaller the group you look
Mhm.
at, the more you will find tendencies that are shared by the members, I think. So if you look at Indo-European as a very large group, you will find certain tendencies, I believe. But if you look at Indo-Aryan, or I don't know, Italo-Celtic or something like that, you will find like more tendencies, more shared tendencies, which I think makes sense. Any other question? Okay, so if we look at the wave theory, as I already said, so we're talking about spatial spreading. So this is something that is a little bit counterintuitive. Um, at least for me, it's hard to imagine two languages that are even in contact, one next to the other, but they don't necessarily share a certain origin or ancestor, but still one phenomenon can spread from one language to the other. So it's very weird for me to understand this, but I think that it is easier to understand if we look at specifically at the Semitic languages. The borders were much less clear than we would like to imagine. So it was much more of a linguistic area than an actual division between languages. So even if we talk about, for example, Canaanite and Aramaic, which are two languages that are both closely related and also had a lot of contact and a lot of mutual influence during millennia. Um, at least at the beginning of the contact between these languages, they weren't as far away as we tend to think uh, linguistically, but also we know that the more you get closer to the border between the languages, the more similar the speech is. So there are these border areas in which people speak something that is between Hebrew and Aramaic. Like specifically for Hebrew and Aramaic, we have this attestation from Dir Allah, for example, and Moabite, which are 2 points. Like Dir Allah is considered Aramaic or something close to Aramaic, and Moabite is considered Canaanite, but they're both from roughly the same area of between Canaan and Aram, or the Aramaic speaking area, and they both exhibit features of both. So there is something in the middle, and it is much more gradual and gradient like than there's an actual border. So that makes more sense, I think, when talking about spreading of features. Um, or I think there's also a good example of in Europe, there was the thing of the shift between an alveolar R or R to a uvular or I don't know, velar or whatever al. Like it happened in Germany, and it happened in also like other I don't know, France and so on. So obviously there was no area between German and French, but um, for example, if we look at Dutch or Scandinavian or stuff like that, there are like these borderline areas that speak like if you there are certain areas that people can speak their own language and the other one can speak their own language and they still are somewhere in the middle. So it's like if we drew the border somewhere else, I don't know if this is clear, but yeah, it's a little bit complicated. Um, but the main point is that if we don't look at languages as something that has clear borders, then it's much easier to fathom the concept of a phenomenon spreading from one place to the other. But it can also be a cultural thing. Like, for example, in German and France, it must have been a cultural thing. And I think it also happened only in cities. So these changes can also affect only certain populations. So, for example, in Arabic, we have this shift of quf to alif in only in urban areas, but all across the Arab world. So these things happen as well. So we do see spatial spreading. It's not something that anyone can really contradict or go against. The question is really how it happens and what is the balance between this and inheritance or the phylogenetic approach. Any question? Okay. In the 1970s, there was a great progress to the study of the classification of the Semitic languages. It was made by Robert Chetron, which was, I think he was French. And he came up with a few, what he called principles of classification. So the two famous principles that he thought about, like, because before that, people were struggling to classify Semitic languages. The whole East Semitic, West Semitic thing uh, did exist and was fairly well established, but the whole inside West Semitic was a little bit harder to classify, and specifically the question of whether South Semitic is a group or not. So we've seen, for example, that Arabic acts like Central Semitic or like Northwest Semitic in many, many aspects. For example, the mood system and many, many others. But it also acts like South Semitic in certain aspects, like the broken plurals and the L stem and so forth. So he went into this issue and established these two principles. The first one is archaic heterogeneity, which is the assumption that if we are comparing two systems two cognate systems, so two inherited systems in two different languages, and one of them is more heterogeneous than the other. That means more diverse or more complicated, so to speak. It is more likely to be more archaic. Now, this is not always true. Of course, it's just a rule of thumb, but it is a good generalization. A good example for this would be the suffix conjugation, which we've talked about. So in the South Semitic languages, or at least modern South Arabian, Old South Arabian, and Ethio-Semitic, we have kaf for the first person singular and for the second person. And in the Central Semitic languages, we have taf for the first person singular and for the second person. But in Akkadian, we have kaf for the first person singular and taf for the second person. So according to the principle of archaic heterogeneity, the system in Akkadian is more likely to be the original. So that is to say that we can derive both systems from it relatively easily with only one step. One of them generalized the kaf, the other generalized the taf. Akkadian did not have to generalize or do any process to achieve its own system. Was that clear? Okay. And the second thing is what he called shared morpholexical innovations, which means essentially that looking at forms or at morphology, or specifically at verbal morphology, is not enough, because we need to internalize the idea that, like, at least from looking at these systems, from looking at verbal morphology in Semitic, and I'm sure he also based it on other languages or language families, we can see that the forms change much less than the meaning. So the meanings of different forms can change, but the forms themselves don't change. So if we look at similar forms, we can ignore the fact that they have developed different meanings, but put the focus on the actual forms. So for example, the suffix conjugation, again, in Akkadian, it's something completely different than in the other languages. In Akkadian, it's dative, in the other languages, it's past. And, or the subordinative marker in Akkadian, and there are many, many examples for this. And the third principle that he has established, but not, he did not number it, is that he thought that retentions and losses are worthless for reconstruction. So if, for example, we see, if we see that Akkadian, East Semitic, modern South Arabian, and Ethio-Semitic, all of them have retained the ipalas form, this does not help me establish or determine that these are one branch, because any language could have retained it. So a retention is not evidence for classification. That's the way he put it. And the same for loss, because if, for example, Aramaic has lost the end stem, and I don't know, Ethio-Semitic has lost the end stem for triradicals, that does not mean they should be classified together, because any language could lose any feature. Later in Kogan's work, he talks about trivial retentions and non-trivial retentions, like retentions that are more have more worth for classification, and the same for losses. But this is the principle of Chetzon. So only innovations count for classification. If there is no shared innovation, then there is no good evidence for classifying a group of languages as a branch. Is everything clear? Any question?
I don't think I understand the third point.
Yes.
So if you have a language and that language has lost a feature of its ancestral language, and then that language splits up and has like several languages derived from it. So neither of these languages has that feature from the proto language. So that would lead me to believe that like losses can have some worth for reconstruction, or for like classify, for like inner like classification.
I completely agree. I completely agree. So So for example, if there is one Ethio-Semitic language that retains something that all the other Ethio-Semitic languages have lost, there is something weird about that, and it does call for a certain solution. And as I said, Kogan in his Habilitación wrote a lot about this, about how we determine the difference between a trivial retention and a non-trivial retention, and trivial loss and non-trivial loss, because some losses are different than others. But in general, when Chetzon said this, he was talking more about things that are prone to be lost, as we said earlier. So for example, the K system or the dual system, the fact that languages have lost this are not necessarily, but you are right then, of course, that if Proto-Arabic has lost a certain feature, then we do expect all of its descendants to have lost this feature as well, and otherwise they would not be its descendants. But I guess the more critical question to them was not determining which language was descendant of which language, but how to classify the groups of languages in which this is a little bit more complicated, because we don't have any idea how Proto-Semitic looked like, so we don't really know what's a retention and what's an innovation. We just have these assumptions. So yeah, I hope this is clearer now. Any other question?
I have another question.
Yeah.
So, is it possible that I don't know, an earlier laws later reintroduced from other sources, and is there a way to tell?
Definitely, this can definitely happen. There are certain examples. I don't know if many, but like the nice example, it would be the interdentals that were lost in both in Hebrew and in Aramaic. The interdental fricatives were lost, but then they were reintroduced as a result of the Esperantization process. So these things can definitely happen. But if you mean like for a language to regrow K system identical to Proto-Semitic or something like that, that would be a little bit more strange. But it is possible, for example, for
I mean, maybe a certain laws is retained in other branches of this language, and later through contact, or I don't know, and this feature would be reintroduced. And in this case, is there a way to, I don't know, to I don't know, to be certain whether it's reintroduced or it's a retention.
Yeah, so what we would expect in such a case would be that if it were a retention, we would find it in certain places in the lexicon and the grammar, usually more widespread, or only in the very, very archaic layer or the most basic layer of the lexicon. While on the other hand, if it is reintroduced through contact or borrowing, we would expect it to be the exact opposite. So to be on the most external layer of the grammar or lexicon, something that is clearly borrowed through, I can say if something is clearly borrowed through, for example, certain cultural aspects of contact. So if we know that, I don't know, trade or agriculture or worship or all of these things were characteristic to a contact between two civilizations, then we know that, for example, I don't know, Streck, for example, told me that he thinks that the word Kabsu in Akkadian is rather likely to be a loanword from, say, Amorite, because we know that they brought sheep from the Amorites or something like that, like that the Amorites were shepherds or something like that. So if we know,
sorry, which word?
Kabsu, like a weird word for like lamb, which is the Pan-Semitic word for lamb or sheep, but in Akkadian it's very rare. And it's with a samech instead of a. So yeah, I can. So what I was trying to say is, like, or the word for church, for example, if we see it in different languages, it is more likely to be borrowed. If something is not borrowed, then we would expect it to be more widespread, I guess. Trying to think of a good example. like for example, dual is something that I would not expect a language to regrow through contact. But I don't know if it's impossible. In general, grammar is something that I would less expect to be borrowed at this point, but it is also possible. Like I know it is possible and it does happen. It's just much rarer. And yes, it would be a great difficulty for anyone analyzing the language to determine whether or not this is a retention or an innovation. And in that case, they would have to analyze all of the different aspects, philological and linguistic and cultural, and to determine whether or not this is possible to be a borrowing. Any other question? Okay. And June and Yoshua, you are very quiet. If you have any question or remark, please feel free. So just mentioning what we talk about when we usually talk about the Proto-Semitic G-stem inflection, or at least some of it. So we have the short prefix conjugation as past or jussive. We have the longer prefix conjugation as future or present. We have the stative, the participle, and the infinitive. And then when we look at the different languages, the basics of the classification is determining which has lost and which has innovated and new one here. So West Semitic has developed a new past based on this dative. It is still an innovation because they didn't take exactly the same form that was, at least if we compare it to Akkadian, but they changed something small about it because the default became Paras or Parasa instead of Paris. So if they would have taken the same form exactly and not changed anything about it, it would be harder to classify this as an innovation. But since they changed the form as well, it is clearly an innovation. But the second thing about this shift is the categorical movement that characterized it, which means that in Akkadian, it is not really a verbal form. Like it's kind of a verbal form, but not really. But in West Semitic, it is par excellence a verbal form. There's nothing non-verbal about it. So in Akkadian, it does not really inflect for time or tense, or does not really have a tense or time related to it. But it is past in the West Semitic languages. So that is why we consider this an innovation, both in the form and in the use. While, for example, East Semitic has developed the Iptalas perfect or some other stuff. So this is the two maybe basic or most common criteria that people mention when talking about the difference between East and West Semitic. Any question about this? We will have a forced break in about a minute, I think. Yes. If we talk about within East Semitic, it's a little bit difficult to say. It's not that easy to classify the languages within East Semitic. Usually people find it easy to just say this is Assyrian, this is Babylonian, but it's not like there's a very easy and comprehensive list of features to say if a certain dialect is one or the other. Sometimes there are points in between, and sometimes there are other things as well. Regarding Eblite specifically, the most